Doesn't that sound dreamy? If you have a melody that's unique and memorable, it can really define the emotion or the vibe of your track. But how come each time you start drawing in melodies, notes, it just doesn't feel natural, it doesn't feel right? It always feels like it's something that you have to do. If you want to create melodies intuitively, you're going to have to know some theory behind it. If you practice that over and over, you'll get it. And today I'm going to show you 15 tips on how to create more unique, more stunning, and interesting melodies. Let's dive in. Today we're going to work with this house groove here. But where do we go from now? Drums do give your track a solid foundation, but now we'd like to add a new level of emotion, a new level of character to our tracks, preferably with a melody. First thing I'm going to do is create a MIDI track and give this MIDI track a bluish color. And I'm going to load a very simple synth sound. My favorite one to use for this is Ableton Live Saw Pure Muted Bass, which is a preset by Analog. It's great to use as a starting point. Don't get overwhelmed by the interface here, that doesn't matter. Then we're going to highlight our entire section that we have here. Hit Command-Shift-M, and that's how we create a MIDI clip. So let's move on to step 1, which is selecting the right scale. A scale basically determines which notes we can use within a certain melodic framework. It's always best to limit yourself to a scale so you don't get confused about which notes you can use and which ones not. And especially if you're just starting out with music and melodies, I highly recommend that you choose a scale straight from the start that works for you. In this case, we have an option to blend in the notes that are within a certain scale. If I click scale here, it'll show me every note that's within the A minor scale, and those notes are highlighted here, blue. I can also select a different note, for example C, within a different scale, for example major, C major. C major only contains the white notes, which is why only the white notes are highlighted here. Interesting. So it's definitely worth getting into scales and how they work. But in this case, we're just going to stick with A minor. I like minor because it usually sounds a bit more melancholic. I just like it. If you don't want to use the minor scale and you're not the melancholic type, you can also go for a major scale. The major scale is well known to sound more happy and uplifting. The Phrygian scale tends to sound very Oriental and Arabic, but for now we're gonna keep it simple and just stick with the A minor scale. Okay, so now we've limited ourselves to a scale, a certain melodic framework, notes that we can use, which is also a great starting point for melodies. And when it comes to melodies, I always think in terms of how the bass note wants to move. So instead of just going in for random notes, I'm going to start off by creating a bass note progression. Where do I want to start? I want to start on the tonic, which is A minor, right? So we're going to start with A. So we're going to create our first note here. And now I'll just have to figure out where I want to move. Do I want to move down or do I want to move up? Usually moving up creates a bit of anticipation and moving down releases that anticipation. So let's move up first. Remember, let's stay within our melodic framework, our scale. So I'm just drawing in notes that are within this highlighted area here. Let's see how this sounds. And then I can just adjust my notes from here. Make sure that it's all within the scale. Would also work. If drawing in bass notes doesn't feel natural to you and you don't exactly know which ones to draw in, you can always search up chord progressions. There's a site that I really like called hooktheory.com that has a function called popular chord progressions under the resource tab over here. And if you open it up, it shows you a variety of different chord progressions based on a numeric system right here. And what's cool is that you can select a scale, A minor or whatever else you want. We're working with A minor, so let's stick with A minor, and then it generates you chords here. So 1, 5, 6, and 4. Let's say I like this chord progression over here. I can download the MIDI and I'll simply drag and drop the MIDI into my DAW over here. Delete these time signatures since we don't need them. Ableton automatically creates them. Delete the tempo automation as well. And since we don't want the entire chord progression but just the bass notes, you can delete every other note here that's not the bass note. So this is how it would sound. And in this case, we have a progression of 1, 5, 6, 4. And you might think, what is 1564? What is this numeric system? Well, that basically determines which note of the scale can be used to create a bass note or a chord. Within Ableton Live, we have the scale button here that we can just click, and it'll highlight only the notes that are within our scale. So let's go back to hooktheory.com. 1, 5, 6, 4. Okay, let's go back into Ableton. 1, that's our A, right? Since we're in A minor. 5 would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's the 5th note of the scale. Remember, we're still within our scale here. So this would be the next note, pitched an octave down. As we can see, an octave is 12 semitones. It's basically the same note, just pitched down. Let's see. That's the same note. 1, 5, 6. So we're going to go from A, which is our root, which is the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Cool. That's the F. Pitch it down an octave. 4. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4. That's the D. Awesome. 1, 5, 6, 4. And if you blend out the scale, you can also do the same here, but I find it a bit too confusing because you also have the notes that are not within the scale. So you'd have to literally skip them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I find it just overall pretty easy to do it here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 1, 5, 6, 4. And from this 1, 5, 6, 4 progression, you can also create chords, but for the sake of simplicity, we're just going to leave it with the bass notes since we just want to create melodies, right? And I've also created a cheat sheet. You can download it in the link down below that illustrates a few different chord progressions that you can use in the minor and major scale. Other than that, you can always visit the site hooktheory.com and it will always generate you a variety of different chord progressions. As you can see here, you can also change the scale at any time to minor, and you can download the MIDI and edit it afterwards. There's also plugins like Scalar 2 that will generate you chords based on the scale that you select. What's cool about this plugin is that you can search up a chord, for example, A minor, and then it shows me the chord here. It shows me how it feels like, and it also generates me a few different chords that are within that scale. What I like about Scalar is that it also shows me the numeric number here. So 1, 5, 6, 4. Sounds pretty good, right? And what I love about this is that you can also go for a different progression. 1, 3, 7. Which is pretty cool. And then you could always take the bass note as a starting point for your melodies. Cool. So what I'm going to do is take the chord progression that we've just created using hooktheory.com. I'm going to double click the MIDI pattern over here, and I'm going to shorten out my notes just like this. So these are a 4th note, 4th note, 4th note, 4th note over here. Let's go back into scale. So we blend in only the notes that are within the scale. So this is what we have so far. Awesome. Step number 3 is to add perfect fourths and perfect fifths to your existing bass note progression. So what do I mean by this? The distance between two notes is called an interval, and depending on the distance, you have a different vibe. So if you go from A to A sharp, for example, that sounds pretty tense and it doesn't sound really pleasant. But if you move from A to E, usually sounds very cheerful and uplifting. That's because this is the perfect fifth, which is 7 semitones. And if we open up this chart that I've prepared for you guys, you can see that 7 semitones or half-tone steps is called the perfect fifth. It's pretty cheerful and it releases tension. It feels very resolved. I've highlighted also a few different intervals that work pretty well. For example, the perfect fourth, which is 5 semitones, also very pleasurable, very light. Then you have minor thirds, for example, that sound very tragic and sad. So minor third, that would be 3 semitones. So what we're going to do now is add those perfect fourths, 5 semitones, and those perfect fifths, which is 7 semitones or halftone steps, to each and every single one of these bass notes. And one of the reasons why it's so confusing, why would you think that 5 semitones is a perfect fourth? Why would they give it such a confusing name, like 5 semitones but perfect fourth? That's because if we move up 5 semitones from the A, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we land on that D. But if we open up the scale over here, we can see that it's the 4th note of this particular scale of A minor. Let's go up again. So tonic, First note, 2, 3, 4. It's the fourth note of the scale, but if we blend out the scale, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 semitones up. That's why it's called the perfect fourth, because it's the fourth note of the scale, but it moves up 5 semitones. This was really confusing for me to understand at the beginning, but if you get it right, you understand a lot more about music theory. So let's draw in the notes here. All right, so A, the perfect fifth is the E, perfect fourth is the D. And I'm just choosing random positions here. I can always play back to see how it sounds. So I'd like 16th notes. I'd like it to be rather shorter. And we can do the same for the E. So now we can just blend in the scale, take whatever we have here, duplicate that over, and adjust it accordingly. All right, so now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is the perfect fifth. And this is the perfect fourth. The fifth note of the scale, which is 7 semitones above the fundamental, the E, and the perfect fourth, which is 5 semitones above the fundamental, the E. But let's blend in the scale for now. Do the same here. Highlight this section, paste it over. Okay, so now we have the F. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we're gonna have to utilize the C and the B. Cool, let's take these. Pitch them up 1. Do the same here. Highlight this section over here. Paste it over. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So we're going to have to use the A as our perfect fifth and the G as our perfect fourth. All right, so this is how our progression sounds so far. Cool, let's take these, pitch them down an octave. So those are the same notes, but we just move down instead of moving up. And it already sounds quite cool. It already sounds like a memorable melody, right? Sounds a bit cheesy now, but don't worry, we're gonna crank it up a notch in a second. Step number 4. Create passing notes. If you want to create variation to your melodic progression here, you're going to have to add so-called passing notes or transitional notes before each and every single bass note hits. So what I'm going to do for that is, again, blend in the scale. So what we're ultimately going to do is move from one note here to the bass note. This note, the G, would be called the passing note. And depending on the distance between this note and this one, you create a different vibe. So how do we want it to sound if we move from one note to the other? Pretty unpleasant, right? But if we move up, sounds a bit better. You can always take the interval chart as a reference, and I'm going to add these passing notes to this one as well. For the D, let's go to the perfect fit. So we could either move up 7 semitones within here, or blend in scale and move up 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's see how this sounds. Interesting. So we've created some passing notes, some notes that move into the bass note and create a bit of tension, release, or variation to the sound. Step number 5 is to vary the intervals. And what I mean by that is that you can change the distance between two notes individually, depending on how it feels. For example, if I move from the A to the E, that's a perfect fifth. And usually the perfect fifth sounds pretty cheerful and releases tension. It sounds very resolved. But if we change this E, which is the perfect fifth, to, let's say, the F, dun dun, it's like, oh, tension. Because this would be the minor sixth. Anguish, sadness creates a lot of tension, right? So do I want this to move from the A to the E and sound really happy, joyful, or move it to the F and create tension? But I kind of like it on the E. Sounds a bit more happy to me now. And I do this for each and every single note. So when I feel like I want to have more tension in a certain section here, I would basically move the note either up or down. So if you want to simplify this, do I want to move the note up or down? Do I want to create tension or release tension with this note? And you can also add in individual notes that create a bit of a tension or, again, release. But I feel like I'm pretty happy with the scale that I have here. If you'd like to take more time, you can also shift these notes individually, which I highly recommend you do. Step number 6 is to create octave variations. So what I'd like to do for this sound, for example, is pitch it up 12 semitones. Shift arrow up basically does the same. It's the same note, but it's just pitched up an octave. And usually if you pitch notes up an octave, it creates a lot of tension and variation within the sound. I'll just select certain notes here and pitch them up an octave. It usually works best for the passing notes. So before you blend in the bass note, you can always pitch this note up an octave. Makes it a bit interesting, right? So octave jumps, keep that in mind. Step number 7 is a pretty fun one. That's velocity changes. Beneath here within Ableton Live, you can see this panel, which is called the velocity panel. This basically determines how loud each and every single note is, how expressive it is. So then we can simply take down certain notes or push certain notes. Usually I like it when the octave jumps are a bit higher in velocity. And I just really dial in on the velocity on each and every single sound. If you're lazy, you can just highlight all of these and hit randomize, but we don't want the velocity randomization range to be that high. So we're just going to dial it down to 28, let's say, and hit randomize here just a few times. Step number 8 is to change the rhythm of the notes. And we change rhythm by either decreasing the note's length, increasing the note's length, or changing the position of the note. So again, we can decrease the note length, change the position of the note or the distance between these two notes, increase this one in its length. Notice how that feels a bit different if we change up the rhythm. So again, let's do that for this one too. Change the note length, change the distance between the notes. Again, change the note length. And another pretty cool tip for this is to highlight a certain section and hit divide by 2, which basically shortens it, or times 2, which increases it in its entire length times 2. Interesting. You can also do that for the entire section, divided by 2. Completely different vibe. I'm going to leave it at our original progression for now though. Step number 9 is to add phrases. If you want to add a phrase, what you're going to want to do is to take your section here and duplicate it over. So you have a total of 2 of these melodic progressions here. Let's recolorize the second one and make it a bit of a different color here. So we know this is phrase 1 and this is phrase 2. And with phrase 2, you want to add some variation. Let's double click phrase 2, and it's always best to change up the passing notes, for example, so the notes that progress into the bass note here. And add some rhythmic variation or some melodic variation towards the end, with the last note usually. We want it to feel a bit different in comparison to the first phrase. What you can also try out is hit invert. For example, I would take these two, invert them, basically flip them upside down. Take these two, invert them. Interesting. What you can also do is take 2 notes, hit reverse, and it flips them here. Cool. Step number 10 is a pretty important one. That's simplification. So we want to make this melody memorable, right? And if it feels too complex, it usually doesn't do the job. So I would like you to ask yourself, does this melody pass the sing test? Is it hummable? Is it something that you feel like is memorable? If not, then you're most likely going to have to simplify it. And you do that by reducing the amount of octave jumps that are in your melody, or simply by taking away certain notes. I could blend out these notes, for example. Kind of like this one. And what you can always try out as well is to just loop a certain section. So this would really simplify it a lot. You can also take this section here. Or the third one. And it always has a bit of a different vibe to each and every single one. Cool. But for now, we're going to take the entire section that we have previously established here. Step number 11 is to add character to your sound. And the best way to do that is by adding some effects. So what I'd like to do is add some echo. You can really take any type of delay or reverb effect. It doesn't matter. I'm just going to take echo for the sake of demonstration here. Reduce the dry wet, put it on ping pong mode, and add some reverb. Dotted eighth notes really works fine. Ooh. Another great way of adding character to your synths is to reduce the cutoff frequency and the resonance. So you basically dial back down the higher frequencies. Cool. Another thing that you can do is change the envelopes of your synth. So you could also, for example, in the amp envelope here, change the decay and sustain. So make it a bit of a shorter, plucky sound. I can also do the same for the filter here. So decrease the envelope, decrease decay and sustain. And if you want to go really in depth here, you can also automate these individual parameters. So you can create an automation for the sustain, the decay, on the filter, also one for the amp envelope. This is so vibey, and if I'd like to change out a few different presets, I would simply duplicate the entire layer here and replace it with a synth of my liking. I really like using Diva, so therefore I'm just going to load it up into my new layer, copy down the MIDI from the upper layer, and mute the upper layer as well, so we just play the Diva. And what I would do from here is select a preset. I have a ton of presets on Lotus Tunes, so feel free to grab them there. I'm going to go through the Synthesia pack and look for a pluck, so a really short sound, right? Just notice how much of a difference that creates. Tip number 12 is to layer and resample. So as you can see, we have two different layers here. And what I would like to do is to blend in the second layer that we've just created with Diva. And I'll just blend out a certain frequency range within the second layer. So let's say I'd like the second layer to emphasize just the higher frequencies and the first layer to emphasize just the lower frequencies, just like this. So we have a layer of two sounds. We can really dial in on the frequency range here. So this is the Diva. This is the saw pure muted bass. What I'm going to do from here on is group these two. And on this group, I'm going to add another echo. So basically the same settings that we previously created on each and every single layer, I'm going to do here. Put it on ping pong. And now I'm going to make use of overlapping notes. Here's where it gets really cool. You can increase the feedback on the echo to, let's say, a pretty extreme setting, above 80%. This is always pretty extreme. I'm going to create a new audio track beneath this group. And I'm going to make sure that the audio is coming from group 17. Record arm this track over here. And now let's record. Let's increase the dry wet here. Let's increase the dry wet more. So what you're gonna do is basically let that run through as long as you'd like, and then you've created a resampled layer down here. This resampled layer, we need to clean it out first by taking out the low end, preferably also the high frequencies. And we can take this resampled layer as another layer to both of our synths. So we've created a pad layer, right? Let's take out the group, so let's see what this guy's doing here. Doesn't that sound dreamy? Okay, tip number 13, it's to make use of sequencers. And if you're especially lazy and uninspired, this trick is a pretty great one. I'm going to create a MIDI track, therefore, and give it a different color here. And within this MIDI track, I'm going to load up a sequencer by Max for Live called AICD. There's a ton of sequencers for Max for Live in Ableton. You can just check out a few. I'm pretty sure there's also sequencers for different DAWs that you can use for your MIDI tracks as well. The sequencer looks like this. And you can also just take your synth sound that we've previously used, the saw pure muted bass, copy it, put it right here. I'm going to blend out the other tracks here just to make sure that we're only working with this track now. Straight from the beginning, it's going to sound very random. You can hit the generate knob here a few times to generate a few different sequences. But it's always pretty random and we don't want that to be the case. So let's go to our MIDI effects and select this effect called scale. So we limit the amount of notes that we want to use within a certain melodic framework, which I explained in step 1. And this scale also has a couple of different presets, a couple different scales, as you can see here. And since we're working with the A minor scale, we're going to look for minor. So let's scroll until we see minor. There we go. And add it right after our AICD rack. Remember, we're working with A minor. So let's select A as our bass note here. Now we can hit generate a couple times again, and it'll always generate us sequences or notes within A minor. You can also change the length to 32 bars, hit generate again. You can also dial down the loop here to 8 bars, let's say. Also take your effects that you've previously used and put them onto this layer as well. Really progressive house, really like that Guy J type sound. Pretty cool way of generating melodies, but for now let's delete this layer and go back to our original synth. Tip number 14 is to create MIDI from audio. So let's say, again, you're not feeling entirely inspired, you don't know what notes to draw in, or you're just lazy to draw in a melody. You can always take a sample as a reference point that already contains either a harmony or melody. I'm going to go into Tulum for that because I know that I have a few song starters and melodies in here. Okay, this one sounds kind of cool. It's in C minor, but that shouldn't be an issue. I'm just going to drag it in here. Make sure that we repitch the sound so it fits our scale. So this sample is in C minor, but we're in A. Therefore, we're just going to have to pitch it down 1, 2, 3. Now it's in A minor. Let's play this sound. If I like this melodic progression, then I can just right click it and convert the melody to a new MIDI track. So then it'll take some time to render this out and it'll give me something confusing that looks like this. Select all of these, hit Command U to quantize them to the grid, and then again, from here you can start adding notes depending on which ones you'd like. So again, pay attention to intervals here. How does the transition between one note to the other sound? And let's delete this sound, replace it with another one. Let's go through a few presets. Cool. And if you're not using Ableton Live, you can also use a different AI plugin that generates you MIDI from audio called Neural Note by Dr. Audio, which is also for free. You can grab it off the internet. I'm just going to add it to my audio layer here, drag in the sample here. It'll generate you a progression here, key A minor. So it'll blend you in the notes that are within the key of A minor, or you can just undo that by selecting C and simply dragging in the MIDI like this. And again, this works for Logic, FL Studio, and other DAWs as well. Of course, it's not always 100% accurate, but you can readjust that later on. But sometimes this plugin gives me more interesting results than Ableton Live's harmony to MIDI or melody to MIDI algorithm. Tip number 15 is to create phrases using samples. So let's say you have a phrase that sounds like this. And you can take the second half of this phrase and replace it with a sample. Let's drag this one up. So you can see this is phrase 1. This is going to be phrase 2. Let's dial this back down. Take this sample, hit Command Shift and drag it like this. Phrase 4. And this is going to be phrase 3. And you want to make sure that all of these are within a certain group. And this group has an effect on the group bus, so the individual phrases melt into one another. Pretty cool, right? Keep in mind that melodies always interplay with chords. If you know about chords and how to create chords using that numerical system that I've shown you previously, the 1-4-5, 1-3-6, then it's easier to come up with melodies. And another tip of mine is to always listen to music. How do the melodies feel? Do they feel happy? Do they feel sad? Pay attention to how the rhythm of the melody sounds, the phrasing sounds, or what intervals they use. This can be pretty interesting. If you like the sounds that I've used in this video, feel free to head on over to lotustunes.com and grab them there. Also, this cheat sheet that I've shown you in the video is going to be for free in the link down below. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.